Hello, everyone, and welcome back to History's Agenda. Tonight, we have part one of Dom and I's interview with David Whelan, the man that wrote the book, Mind Games, The Assassination of John Lennon. He is the foremost researcher into this event, this assassination, and we are lucky enough. We had like a 3-hour interview with him, and tonight we're going to give you part one. A couple things I do want to mention that on our podcast, Dom and I did on the assassination of John Lennon just reached 20,000 downloads. And I want to thank you for all that hard work and that you've all appreciated. So thank you very much. That is, out of all the podcasts I do, that is the greatest return. And I want to thank you. And please keep liking, keep subscribing, keep listening. David is the foremost authority into this area, and you will find by listening to him, the detail of his knowledge is amazing. A couple things I want to mention. We had a couple of technical difficulties. So you may some camera issues on Dom's camera, so you may see me not in my chair, or you may not see Dom during the interview, and it was just a couple of little blurbs there. With no further ado, part one of our interview with David Whelan. Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to History's Agenda. We are so lucky, Dom and I, to have David Whelan with us today. The follow-up from our other podcast regarding the assassination of John Lennon. David is, in our eyes, and I don't mean to speak for you, Dom, one of the foremost authorities on this assassination about everything.
He's the guy that literally wrote the book.
Wrote the book, yeah.
He wrote the book.
Here we go. We all have it next to us. Mind Games, the assassination of John Lennon is, matter of fact, it's not only a good book, it's marvelously written.
Thank you.
It's almost conversational, where you're saying, hey, look here, look at this. This doesn't make sense, but don't believe me. Keep looking. Look yourself. And it's really the way when you talk about these conspiracies, and we talked a little bit about before RFK, JFK, we all know the stories. But I think this goes with the book and everything. We don't know who or why, even though we can surmise. All we have is the facts. And we ask our listeners or readers or everything to look at those facts and reach your own conclusion. You know, and when things don't make sense, you know, I'm always troubled. I'm a logical thinker, obviously. When things don't make sense, means you do not have all the facts. As we said, David, thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for those kind words. It's lovely to be here.
So, Dom, you want to start us off, or you?
Yeah, just David, how did you get into the subject in the first place?
I think, like you guys, always fascinated by the JFK case. I've always had that as a point of interest in my life. The Oliver Stone film in '91 just completely blew me away. That was my, to coin a cliche, red pill moment. I have Irish parentage, so JFK in my family was a big deal. You know, he's kind of like a Irish royalty, really. His picture was on the walls when I was growing up in all the different family houses and stuff. And when I saw that film, I just thought, wow, we've been lied to. There was a lot more to his assassination than a lone nut. So that was always in the back of my mind. But I've had a busy career in television, mainly sports, actually, nothing to do in the sort of the height of my career in TV. But I have worked in TV news as well when I was working my way up. So I've done a lot of research as well, which is important, I think, doing this kind of work. A lot of film research, a lot of news research. So it all sort of moved up to 2020, guys, where I was like everybody, just twiddling my thumbs. And in the early days of the lockdown, quite enjoying parking everything. And just, for the first time in a long, long time, I felt like I had a free mind and it was open and I was relaxed and I was actually really enjoying it, to be honest with you. Lots of long walks with the dogs and stuff. And just, yeah, it was great. Lovely to put everything on pause. And I was just listening to a podcast, which you guys probably know, called Black Ops Radio, which is a JFK assassination podcast with brilliant Len Osanic. And they were talking about the JFK, obviously. And then Jim D'Eugenio, the brilliant researcher who's often featured on the show, he got to a letters section at the end of the show. Now, normally at this point, I turn, and no offense to Jim, but I turn off that point. I think I've heard all the main information in the show, so I'm just going to now move on and go to another podcast. But for some reason, thank God I did. I kept listening, and someone wrote a letter into Jim and Len on this show saying, "What do you think about the doorman at the Dakota when John Lennon got assassinated, being a CIA operative?" And I just thought, wow, that's interesting. Never knew that before, because my only previous thing about the Lennon assassination was as a 14-year-old being told it was a lone nut who had a book and he was a bit crazy and he was a Lennon fan and he shot John and it's an open and shut case and he admitted it. So I never bothered to even think about it. It was just so obvious that this guy who admitted it did it. So that can't have been a JFK sort of thing. But this CIA sort of guy, that's interesting. So I went home that day, literally that day, started to Google this doorman, Jose Padermo, Cuban. And there was a Jose Padermo who was a CIA operative, very serious dude, who was head of an assassination group called Op 40, a bunch of right-wing Cubans who were going to go in after the Bay of Pigs and do a cleanup for anybody that didn't go with the new right-wing program. So this, if this was the Jose Padermo working the door when John Lennon was assassinated, I thought, wow, that's serious. That's not a coincidence. That's like one of the world's most famous assassins was working the door when there was one of the world's most famous assassinations. Got to be linked. I've subsequently found out Jose Patermo is a very common name in Cuba, and it wasn't. Op 40 CIA Jose Patermo was not Dakota Jose Patermo. They got very different age groups, and we know a fair bit about Dakota Jose, different people altogether. But they concealed his name after the murder for 7 years, so he became a bit of a kind of mystery figure. They never described anybody that was there that night in the media. The media were completely asleep. So all the main players, apart from Yoko Ono, were completely kept in the dark from the public. So once I'd gone through the Jose Padermo kind of initial research, I just started to look at the murder itself, okay, so where was he shot? Okay, he's walking in, he was with his wife. And then I started to kind of go through some different reports and I just thought, hang on a minute, there's a real lack of detail here. Like, where was he shot? And what did he do after he was shot? And what was his wife doing? And who else was there? And then I started to keep digging and digging and digging. And then eventually it all just completely exploded when I spoke to the surgeon.
Interesting. Interesting. So in our previous episode, we discussed what John was up to from the 60s up till 1980. Could you take us through Mark David Chapman?
Yeah, sure. Chapman was a typical child of the 60s and early 70s. He was born in 1955. So once the Beatles turned up, he's kind of like, 9, 10, 11. He's a fan, but he's a fan of all music. Chapman's big hero was actually a guy called Todd Rundgren. He wasn't a massive John Lennon fan.
I was a huge Todd Rundgren fan.
Yeah, Todd's a genius. Todd, those run of albums in the 70s, incredible artist. So that was Chapman's main thing. He had a military father, don't they all? Bit of a distant father who then went and left the military and went to work for a bank. He had a nurse mother. He had a sister, real cookie cutter Southern. He was initially born in Texas, I think, and then he moved to Decatur, Georgia. So classic Southern childhood. He was into music. He had lots of friends. He was very sociable. Nothing weird about him. He wasn't into capturing the riot. That's a complete myth. There's a lot of guys who've gone on documentaries and said, "Oh yeah, I grew up with Mark, and he was always reading this book." What a load of nonsense! Do you remember the books your friends were reading when you were 10, guys? You know, it's just ridiculous. So, and what 10-year-old is going to read Catcher in the Rye? But anyway, we'll move on from that. So he had a very sort of okay childhood. He started to dabble in drugs around about the age of 14, 15. So late 60s, early 70s, classic LSD time, Jimi Hendrix, psychedelia. You know, everyone was doing it at the time from my research. So him getting into hash and then getting into LSD was a pretty straight progression from, you know, with the group of friends that he was hanging out with at the time. He didn't do heroin. That's a complete lie. Again, people try to embellish. But he was seriously into LSD, and he had a few weird experiences with that, and he took a lot of it. He was quite into it, probably too much, and he had some bad trips. Some of his friends told me, so that probably didn't do his brain any good. But when he was sort of 15/16, Mark found God, and he found God through a local Decatur church, which was run by a guy called Charles McGowan, Pastor Charles McGowan. And Charles McGowan was ex-Navy intelligence, which is interesting. And he was in Washington working for Navy intelligence in 1963, which is a very interesting year to be in Washington working in intelligence. So that's who Charles McGowan was. Now, Charles McGowan was a pastor at this point when Mark bumped into him around about 1970. And Charles McGowan, with another friend of his at the time in Decatur, a guy called Harold Blankenship, were trying to set up a new strand of Presbyterianism because they didn't think that Presbyterianism was sort of right wing enough for them. And they were slightly concerned about all of the kind of liberal stuff like allowing women to be preachers and same sex marriage and abortion rights. That they wanted it to go further to the right. So they set up a new Presbyterian organization called the PCA, the Presbyterian Church of America. And Harold and Charles were the kind of two of the sort of initial founding fathers, with a lot of other more far right, I would say, people. Not a nice bunch of people really, but very hellfire-ish kind of types who were all about, you know, you've got to follow the Bible, and that's that. So these are the kind of people that Mark Chapman was getting involved with. Harold Blankenship's daughter was called Jessica, who Mark had a crush on when he was 15, 16. So she was kind of almost the lure that sort of brought Chapman into Harold and Charles's kind of orbit. Then, very strangely, when Mark was sort of 15/16, when he got off LSD, got off drugs, and started to go to Christian camps, he was sent with Jessica via Charles and Harold to a guy called Mr. Krause, who was a sort of, can I describe him as a kind of crazy exorcist? But of course, in Presbyterian circles, they wouldn't use that Catholic term. They called them, I think, deliverance guys. They sort of they
Right.
deliver you
Right.
from evil spirits. So Mark was starting to have these, as he described it, and Jessica's described it. There's these really disturbing sessions with this guy. It was like a group thing, and there was like, you know, they were trying to cast demons out of Mark, and there was guys pressing down on his chest and pressing down his back, saying, you know, you're possessed by demons, you're possessed by demons. You know, and Mark just found all this incredibly troubling. And he said they talked more about the devil and sin than they did Jesus. So, and I think that was where Mark was initially, they were starting to sort of, the people who were going to put Mark through an MKUltra program were doing what we've read now and lots of research about MKUltra was sort of basically cracking him. They were cracking, and religious mania is a great way to crack someone's brain, to actually get them to sort of shut half their brain down so that you can actually insert something into that half that they can't cope with the trauma. And this was part of the techniques of MKUltra at the time that's now come out in lots of documentation and documentaries, and people have actually admitted it who worked on those programs. So I think that's where it all started for Mark. And then from that point onwards, it's just a case of Mark hanging out with people that wouldn't really expect him to hang out with. So he hung out with a guy called Dana Reeves, who became a sheriff. Dana was a very different guy to the Christian people Mark was hanging around with. Dana was, by all accounts, quite aggressive, was very much into guns. And I think this was shaping Mark into a kind of getting Mark familiar with a more kind of violent, aggressive, right-wing kind of mindset. Because a lot of Mark's friends told me before he got into Christianity, he was the classic kind of left-wing, hippie, easygoing guy. But once he got into this kind of Christian right-wing nationalistic kind of group led by people like Charles McGowan and Dana Reeves, he became a lot more right-wing and a lot more intolerant and a lot more shut down and a lot more secretive. And then, we can go on, guys. You want me to keep going up until Hawaii, or do you want to sort of jump in at this point?
Oh,
Or
definitely want to get into Hawaii for sure.
yeah, yeah. I mean, to get to Hawaii, Hawaii was 77 when Mark was 22. But I think before Hawaii, he went to theological college. He tried to get into, doing that kind of thing. He flunked that. He broke up with Jessica, but he kept going back. Interestingly, throughout all of Mark's life, right up until the murder, he kept going back to the Blankenship house. And it's interesting to note that, because the famous journalist Craig Unger, who worked, I think, for the New York Magazine back in the 70s and 80s, great guy, Craig, written some amazing books. He told me that when he went to speak to Harold Blankenship after the murder, I think it was 1981, he did a really interesting piece for the New Yorker. He said Harold Blankenship, A, was anti-Semitic and very hostile to Craig. But he also said that Harold actually admitted to him that he gave Chapman the idea to kill John Lennon, which I found quite interesting, sort of boasting about that. So I thought that's quite interesting that's come from that kind of Christian nationalistic kind of, and that wouldn't surprise me, because I think Harold was potentially using Mark's love for Jessica to keep control over him, because Mark kept going back to the Blankenship house constantly.